So, if you ever take a really close look at a modern medical chart, I mean, it can feel a lot like reading the guest list to a very bizarre historical dinner party.
Oh, yeah, completely.
You've got Parkinson, Alzheimer, Down, Asperger. It's like this weird roll call of historical figures just sitting right there on the page.
Right. It really is like stepping into a crowded room of ghosts every time you get a diagnosis.
Yeah.
And, that really brings us to the core of what we're going to unpack with you in this deep dive today, which is eponyms.
Eponyms, yeah.
Yeah, the word itself, it actually comes from the Greek. So epi meaning upon, and onyma, which means name. So, simply put, it's just a term that keeps someone's identity alive inside of our ordinary vocabulary.
Which, when you think about it, is just such a strange way to handle science, right?
Yeah.
So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out why medical vocabulary sounds so much like this historical roll call, rather than an actual description of the diseases themselves. We're going to trace the messy and pretty much accidental origins of terms like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. And then we'll look at the really intense modern controversies over, who actually gets memorialized in the dictionary.
Because it really forces us to look at how human beings attempt to organize the unknown.
Yeah. Right. So I guess here is the framing question for you. Is this whole naming convention just a harmless, sort of quirky relic of the past? Or is it actually a fundamentally flawed way to organize what we know about the human body?
Well, when you look at the historical record, the system is far more flawed than most people realize. Like, the biggest issue is that when we hear a disease named after a person, we naturally assume this very specific narrative of discovery.
Like a light bulb moment.
Yeah, exactly. We assume that if it's called Parkinson's disease, well, a lone genius named Dr. Parkinson discovered it, he cracked the code, and he rightfully claimed the title for all of history.
Right, like you plant the flag, you get your name on the map. That's just the intuitive logic of how we think discovery works.
But that narrative is actually almost entirely false. Eponyms were not a design system at all. Nobody sat down at a big medical conference and decided, hey, this is how we're going to categorize human pathology.
It just kind of happened.
It was essentially an accident of history. So if you look back at the 1800s, medicine was centered in just a handful of European teaching hospitals. And it was a heavily oral mentor-apprentice culture.
Okay, so picture the Victorian hospital amphitheater, right? Doctors in stiff coats taking notes while the senior surgeon speaks.
Yes, perfect mental image. And later, when those colleagues or students were discussing a similar patient in the ward, they didn't have a standardized, peer-reviewed terminology yet. Global databases just didn't exist.
Wow, yeah, of course.
So it was just practically easier to say, like, oh, the patient has that thing Parkinson described, rather than trying to invent some complex, standardized Greek term right on the spot.
So it's essentially just workplace shorthand that got frozen in time.
Precisely. Over decades, that thing Parkinson described calcified into Parkinson's disease. And in almost all the classic cases, the person whose name survived, they didn't name the condition after themselves.
Which is wild. And the story of James Parkinson from the sources perfectly illustrates this. He was a London surgeon in the early 1800s, but he was also an apothecary, a political radical, and a fossil collector.
A true Renaissance man.
Right. And in 1817, he published this 66-page pamphlet called An Essay on the Shaking Palsy. And he definitely did not call it Parkinson's disease. He actually called it paralysis agitans.
And what's really remarkable about Parkinson's original essay is how he diagnosed the condition. We think of rigorous clinical trials today with blood work and brain scans.
Oh, yeah, the modern standard.
But Parkinson built his theory on a strikingly small evidentiary base. He only had a handful of cases, and several of them he hadn't even formally examined in a clinic.
Wait, didn't he literally just watch them walking past him on the street in London?
He did.
He just observed this characteristic shuffling gait and forward-stooped posture from a distance and wrote it down.
Yeah, it shows incredible observational skill, but his name wasn't actually attached to the disease until roughly 60 years later, in the 1870s.
60 years.
Yeah, a highly influential French neurologist named Jean-Martin Charcot, who was working in Paris, he decided to rename the condition Maladie de Parkinson.
See, reading that, I totally assumed Charcot was just being, professionally generous to a predecessor he admired, but there was actually a scientific motive, too, right?
There was, yeah. Charcot wanted to correct Parkinson's original term, paralysis agitans, because, as Charcot noted after studying many more patients, they aren't actually paralyzed.
Right, the tremor is just one feature of a much broader neurological decline.
Exactly.
Mm.
Charcot felt the original name was scientifically inaccurate, so he essentially just used Parkinson's name as a placeholder to replace the bad medical term.
So 60 years after the fact, a French doctor names a disease after an English doctor who originally called it something else entirely. That completely shatters that lone genius planting a flag myth.
It really does.
And then the origins of Alzheimer's disease reveal an even darker side of how these names get chosen.
Oh, absolutely. So Alois Alzheimer was a German psychiatrist, and starting in 1901, he examined a 51-year-old patient named Auguste Deter in a Frankfurt asylum.
Okay.
He meticulously documented her severe memory loss, her paranoia, her disorientation. And after she died in 1906, he performed the autopsy and found the physical evidence in her brain.
Like the clumps of misfolded proteins and twisted fibers that essentially choke the brain cells?
Yes, exactly. What we now call amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. So Alzheimer's presented these findings at a psychiatry conference, but he didn't raise his hand and say, I dubbed this Alzheimer.
Right. It was actually his supervisor, Emil Kraepelin, who did that. Kraepelin was this massively famous, very powerful psychiatrist who ran the institute where Alzheimer worked.
The big boss.
Yeah, and Kraepelin coined the term Alzheimer's disease in a 1910 edition of his own authoritative psychiatry textbook, which, cemented it into the medical literature forever.
And we really have to look at Kraepelin's underlying motivation here, because this wasn't even a unique discovery.
Wait, really?
Yeah, around the exact same time Alzheimer was looking at Auguste Deter's brain, a Prague-based pathologist named Oskar Fischer was independently describing very similar findings in elderly dementia patients.
Wow, okay.
Arguably, Fischer had an even larger, more comprehensive case series than Alzheimer did.
So Kraepelin was basically the CEO of this medical institute, and he got to dictate the product branding.
Exactly.
Fisher worked at a rival institute, so Kraepelin had every incentive to elevate his own subordinate just to make his own institute look superior. He basically used his institutional power to write Fisher out of the history books.
That's exactly what happened. And this dynamic where credit flows to power or prestige rather than the original discoverer is so incredibly common in the history of science that in 1980, a statistician named Stephen Stigler formalized it.
Ah, Stigler's law of eponymy.
Yes, which states that no scientific discovery is named after its original discoverer.
But the truly brilliant part is how Stigler published this. He purposefully attributed the idea of Stigler's law to a sociologist named Robert K. Merton, who had actually studied the phenomenon earlier.
It's hilarious.
I know, he literally named a law about stolen credit after himself while giving credit to the guy he stole it from right there in the text.
It is a perfect self-demonstrating academic joke, but it really highlights the psychology of how human beings assign credit. We just naturally gravitate toward famous names and institutional authority.
Because there was no central governing body vetting terminology back then, right?
Right. In the 1800s and early 1900s, naming was just a historical popularity contest, completely dictated by whoever wrote the most widely read textbooks.
And the result of that popularity contest is this massive linguistic problem that plagues doctors and patients to this day. Because these names were bestowed by powerful peers rather than being logically constructed, they are completely opaque.
Yeah, we have to draw a hard line here between a label and a description. An eponym is merely a label.
Right. So imagine you're sitting in a doctor's office. You're terrified because you've been feeling awful, and the doctor hands you a diagnosis of hypertension.
Okay, pretty common.
If you know even basic Greek and Latin roots, you can decode that. Hyper means high. Tension means pressure. High blood pressure. The word literally teaches you what is happening inside your blood vessels.
That's a great example. Contrast that with hearing you have Parkinson's disease. That phrase teaches you absolutely nothing except that a historical figure named Parkinson is involved somehow.
You can't reverse engineer it at all.
No, you can't reverse engineer the physical realities of the disease, like the resting tremors, the extreme slowness of movement, which doctors call bradykinesia, or the fact that a specific dopamine-producing factory in the brain, the substantia nigra, is failing.
None of that is communicated by the syllables Parkinson. The word is just semantically empty.
It's like trying to guess someone's computer password without a single hint. There's no logic to follow. You just have to brute force memorize it, the same way you memorize that the word Xerox means photocopy.
And for a patient, that opacity must be incredibly frustrating. I mean, you get diagnosed with Crohn's disease, and the name of the condition you have to live with tells you zero about your own biology.
And Crohn's disease is another classic example of Stigler's law in action, actually. It's named for a gastroenterologist, Burl Crohn, who described the inflammatory bowel disease in 1932.
Right?
But he didn't do it alone. He published the foundational paper with two co-authors, Leon Ginsberg and Gordon Oppenheimer.
But because Crohn's name came first alphabetically on the paper, Ginsberg and Oppenheimer just vanished from common usage. It's totally arbitrary.
Exactly.
Which brings up another huge misconception about eponyms from the sources. People often assume that if a disease has a person's name, it honors the patient who suffered from it.
Yeah, the intuitive logic being, you suffer from it, your body endures it, so you own the name. But in the vast majority of classic medical eponyms like Parkinson, Alzheimer's, Down, Crohn, Cushing, Addison, Hodgkin, the name honors the physician who observed the condition.
The patients, like Augustator, are usually just relegated to footnotes.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
There are rare exceptions, though. The most famous one in America is probably Lou Gehrig's disease.
Right, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. It became widely called Lou Gehrig's disease in the U.S. after the famous New York Yankees first baseman was diagnosed in 1939.
Which forced his retirement and made the condition a huge household topic. But honoring a famous sufferer is highly unusual. And interestingly, the underlying disease had been clinically described decades earlier by Jean-Martin Charcot.
Charcot strikes again. He is everywhere in this history.
He really is. In French-speaking medicine, ALS is still often called maladie de Charcot. So you have the exact same neurodegenerative disease with two entirely different eponymous traditions depending on where you live.
One honoring the observing doctor, and one honoring the suffering patient. It's wild. And reading through these sources, the sheer inconsistency of this system leads to some incredibly intense debates over tiny details, like the medical grammar war over the apostrophe S.
Oh, the apostrophe war, the battle between Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease, or Down syndrome versus Down syndrome.
The American Medical Association's Manual of Style has been pushing since the 1970s to drop the possessive apostrophe S. But, I mean, is it really that absurd to keep it? It feels so much more natural to say Parkinson's.
Well, the AMA's logic is rooted in historical accuracy. They argue the named physician did not own the disease. Like Dr. Down did not have Down syndrome. He merely described it in a paper.
I see.
The AMA argues that using the possessive implies the patient possessed the condition, which is true for Lou Gehrig, sure,
Yeah.
but factually false for the doctors.
But British and international usage often flat out ignores the AMA and keeps the possessive anyway because it just sounds better to the ear, so you end up with no global consensus.
Right.
But, you know, an annoying, hard-to-decode name or a missing apostrophe is ultimately just an academic headache. Where this deep dive gets genuinely heavy is when we look at when this opacity becomes dangerous. Like, what happens when the historical figure being honored turns out to be a monster?
This is where the debate moves from linguistic hair-splitting to a genuine moral crisis. Over the last few decades, the medical community has faced a massive reckoning regarding eponyms tied to Nazi-era figures.
Yeah, the sources outline a few major examples, starting with Reiter syndrome.
Right. Hans Reiter was a German physician. In 1916, he described a specific triad of symptoms in a patient: joint inflammation, painful urination, and pink eye.
Okay.
For decades, the medical community called this cluster Reiter syndrome. But as historical research expanded, it became widely known among clinicians that Reiter had been a senior SS officer.
Wow.
Yeah, he was a Nazi public health official who explicitly authorized lethal medical experiments on prisoners at the Buchenwald concentration camp.
So you have a very real modern situation where a patient is walking into a rheumatology clinic, suffering from joint pain, and essentially being handed a diagnosis that memorializes a war criminal.
Exactly. And once this history became undeniable in the 2000s, major medical bodies moved swiftly to abandon the name. They replaced it with the purely descriptive term reactive arthritis.
And it wasn't an isolated incident either. There was also Wegener's granulomatosis.
Right, named after Friedrich Wegener. He was a German pathologist who described a rare autoimmune disease involving severe blood vessel inflammation.
But the research caught up with him too.
It did. Research in the 2000s revealed Wegener was a member of the Nazi Party. He had documented ties to a Nazi racial hygiene office and had possible proximity to atrocities in occupied Poland.
So in 2011, rheumatology bodies officially renamed the disease granulomatosis with polyangiitis, or GPA. They deliberately eliminated the eponym entirely.
They didn't even try to find a cleaner historical person to name it after. They shifted entirely to a descriptive system.
But I think the most culturally explosive example of this reckoning has to be Asperger syndrome.
Oh, without a doubt. Austrian pediatrician Hans Asperger described a specific pattern of autistic traits in children in Vienna in 1944. And for a very long time, the dominant narrative was that Asperger was a lone advocate, a kind of hero protecting his neurodivergent patients under the brutal Nazi regime.
But then in 2018, historian Herwig Czech published exhaustive archival research that completely overturned that hero image. The recovered documents showed Asperger actively cooperated with the Nazi child euthanasia program. I mean, he personally referred some children under his care to a specific clinic, Am Skiedelgrund, knowing they would be killed there.
It's horrific. Now, diagnostically, the term Asperger's had already started fading. In 2013, the psychiatric manual known as the DSM-5 folded it into the broader category of autism spectrum disorder, simply because it made more scientific sense to view autism on a spectrum.
Right, the clinical shift had already happened.
But the 2018 historical revelation destroyed any cultural or sentimental reason people had for keeping the name alive informally.
Now, it is worth noting that eponyms can be retired for purely scientific reasons too, without any dark moral history attached. The sources mention Munchausen syndrome as a good palate cleanser here.
Right, a much lighter example.
It was coined in 1951, named after a fictional, tall-tale-telling baron, to describe patients who fabricate illness for attention. Modern manuals just call it fictitious disorder because it is more clinically accurate. But these Nazi-affiliated names spark a much deeper philosophical divide. When you read the arguments from the traditionalist camp, you can see why medical historians push back against scrubbing these names.
Yeah, the traditionalist argument is primarily rooted in continuity. They argue that these terms are so deeply embedded in a century of global clinical speech, textbooks, and research papers that retroactively changing them creates dangerous confusion for doctors.
Which is a valid concern in a high-stakes field like medicine.
Right. They also argue that erasing the name sanitizes medical history, hiding the uncomfortable truth that medicine has often advanced alongside immense cruelty.
But then, the reformers argue that the primary function of medical language isn't to be a history museum.
Right.
They argue that a descriptive term is inherently better because it's accurate and teachable. And in cases like Reiter and Wegener, they argue that removing the honor is just a matter of basic human decency. A patient's daily diagnosis shouldn't double as a monument to someone who committed atrocities.
We're seeing a fundamental tension between preserving the historical record and prioritizing the well-being and clarity of present-day medicine. And this moral reckoning with the past has forced the global medical community to completely rethink how it organizes diseases today.
Which introduces a fantastic term from the source material, nosology.
Yes, nosology. It's the branch of medicine concerned with the systematic classification of diseases. The debate over whether to name something after a person or describe what the disease actually does is, at its core, a nosological argument.
Right.
And today, the ultimate authority on this classification is the World Health Organization and their International Classification of Diseases, or the ICD system.
And the ICD heavily favors descriptive terms, largely out of sheer practicality, right? I mean, if you are translating a medical code into 50 different languages for a global health database, the name of a 19th century Western doctor means absolutely nothing in most of the world. It just doesn't translate.
Exactly. The code must be unambiguous across cultural lines. And you can see this nosological shift perfectly illustrated in the long evolution of how we name Down syndrome.
Tracing this timeline really shows how medical naming reflects the prejudices of its era. It starts in 1866 with an English physician named John Langdon Down. He formally describes the condition, but he uses the deeply racist label Mongolian idiocy.
Right. Down's label was based on a pervasive, now discredited pseudoscientific theory of ethnic hierarchy. He claimed these patients physically resembled a lower racial type from Asia.
It's awful.
It was a terrible, stigmatizing term that unfortunately stuck around for decades.
Fast forward nearly a century to 1959, a French geneticist named Jérôme Lejeune utilizes modern chromosome staining, which is a tool Down couldn't have even imagined, and he finds the actual biological cause, an extra copy of chromosome 21.
Yet, despite knowing the genetic reality, the old racist name persisted until 1965. It only changed because the World Health Organization formally moved to drop the term Mongolism after the government of Mongolia lodged a formal diplomatic complaint.
Which is entirely understandable. So, as a mid-century compromise, the WHO replaced the slur with the eponym we use today, Down's syndrome. The modern eponym was actually a progressive step forward at the time.
It was a vast improvement. But even that compromise mentality, relying on a person's name to fix a bad term, is pretty much over. And this brings us to why all this history matters to how we navigate health crises today.
Right.
In May 2015, the World Health Organization issued sweeping, formal best practice guidelines for naming any newly identified human diseases.
And their explicit recommendation was to completely avoid personal names. But they went further than that. They also said to avoid geographic locations, which are called toponyms,
Like Lyme disease?
right, named after a town in Connecticut,
Oh.
or the Spanish flu, which didn't even originate in Spain but caused immense stigma for the country.
They also recommended avoiding animal names like swine flu or bird flu because those names inevitably lead to public panics and unnecessary slaughters of livestock.
Ah, that makes sense.
The WHO finally officially recognized that names carry profound weight. They carry bias, they cause economic damage, and they inflict real-world harm on marginalized groups.
This is exactly why the novel coronavirus identified in late 2019 was given a deliberately neutral, frankly sterile acronym, COVID-19, Coronavirus Disease 2019.
Exactly.
By choosing that name, global health authorities broke a naming tradition that had stood for centuries. No person's name, no geography, just pure, unadulterated data.
It represents the ultimate triumph of the descriptive, nosological approach over the messy, historical, eponymous approach.
It really feels like we are transitioning from naming devastating hurricanes after people like Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Andrew to just calling them severe storm category 4.
That's a great analogy.
By removing the human element, we absolutely gain scientific accuracy and we gain global neutrality, but we lose a little bit of that historical flavor.
It is the inevitable trade-off of modern evidence-based science.
So let's tie all these threads together. We have journeyed from James Parkinson diagnosing patients by just watching them shuffle down a London street to the institutional power dynamics of Emil Kraepelin naming Alzheimer's to spite a rival.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We've navigated the incredibly petty grammar wars over an apostrophe, the profound moral reckoning of removing Nazi-associated names, all the way to the WHO's modern, sterile guidelines that gave us COVID-19. Eponyms really are this heavily flawed yet utterly fascinating lens into how human beings try to map out the unknown.
They really are a reminder that science isn't just cold data. It is made of people. It is driven by their politics, their blind spots, their prejudices, and their brilliant accidents.
Which leaves you with an interesting thought to mull over. As modern medicine successfully phases out eponyms in favor of perfectly accurate, highly clinical descriptive terms, are we at risk of entirely erasing the human stories that built modern medicine?
The rivalries, the thefts of credit, the historical drama, those stories are often what make the history of science so compelling to learn in the first place. If the language of medicine becomes completely anonymous and purely descriptive, we gain clarity, sure, but what context gets lost?
It is definitely something to think about the next time you are sitting in a waiting room looking at a medical chart. Because as we've learned today, those names aren't just empty labels. They are the remaining guests lingering at a very complicated historical dinner party. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.